My name is Lydia Rowan, and the last memory I had before everything inside me went dark was the sound of my own crutch cracking against the back of my skull while my mother stood in the doorway telling my brother to hit harder as if she were cheering for her favorite team instead of watching her son beat her daughter to the floor. The house smelled like bleach and stale cigarettes, and the leftover pot roast she had been simmering since noon, but all I could taste was metal in my mouth. As I crawled across the hardwood floor, trying to reach the edge of the kitchen counter, where I hoped I could pull myself upright, even though my right leg had barely healed from surgery and still buckled every time I put weight on it. Ethan grabbed the back of my hoodie and yanked me toward him like he was dragging a bag of trash, and the movement sent a bolt of pain so sharp through my knee that I screamed before I could stop myself. He hated when I screamed. He said it made him want to prove a point. He lifted the crutch again, the same crutch I had used every day for the last 6 weeks just to get from my bed to the bathroom, and he swung it with both hands like a baseball bat, slamming it into my shoulder so hard I saw white flashes explode across my vision. I remember trying to shield my head with my arms, and I remember thinking that if I passed out too soon, he would blame me for being weak again because everything was always my fault in this house. From the time I lost my father at 12 to the time my mother decided that Ethan deserved everything and I deserved nothing, I heard her voice behind him, cool, flat, emotionless, the same tone she used when she told me I was selfish for asking for help after surgery. She said, "Ethan do it properly, she needs to learn," and I remember turning my head just enough to see her silhouette framed by the yellow light of the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression bored like she was watching a child misbehave rather than watching one child brutalize another. I begged in a voice so small it embarrassed me even in that moment. "Mom, please make him stop. Please, I can't breathe." She lifted an eyebrow, looked straight at me and said, "Then stop provoking him, Lydia, because you always bring this on yourself." Ethan grinned when she said that, and he raised the crutch again, this time bringing it down on the side of my ribs, and I felt something crack inside me like a twig snapping under a boot. My breath vanished. My arms gave out. My cheek hit the floor, and the wood felt cold against my skin. I tasted blood. I heard Ethan pantings above me like he had just finished a workout, and somewhere in the haze, I heard him spit out, "You're so pathetic, you ruin everything." And the rage in his voice sounded like something that had been building for years, not minutes. My head spun so violently that the ceiling kept tilting in and out of focus, and the last thing I managed to see clearly was my mother stepping forward just enough to block the hallway light, her shadow falling across my face as she said louder this time, "Hit harder. She still hasn't learned." Ethan hesitated only long enough to shift his grip. Then he brought the crutch down toward my head, and the world around me slammed shut like someone had flipped a switch, and I remember thinking in that brief second before unconsciousness swallowed me whole that maybe this time they had finally done enough damage that I wouldn't have to wake up and go through it again. But I did wake up. I woke up to hospital lights buzzing overhead and a nurse shouting for a doctor and my mother sitting beside the bed with her arms folded and a rehearsed mask of concern plastered over her face, telling anyone who would listen that I had fallen again because I was clumsy and reckless and never listened to her advice. And as soon as she finished her speech, she leaned down close enough that only I could hear her hiss one sentence that shoved me harder than any blow Ethan had ever delivered. She whispered, "You will not tell them anything, Lydia, because no one will believe you, and if you ruin your brother's future, I swear to God I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." I was 24 years old when my brother broke my crutch over my back, but the truth is, the violence in our house began long before my bones ever cracked. Because in the Rowan family, pain was not an accident. It was a language, and my mother spoke it fluently, while Ethan learned it the way other boys learned baseball or math, or how to rebuild an engine. People who met my mother Marlene in town always said she was a respectable woman, the kind who volunteered at church bazaars and baked pies for charity auctions, and kept her flower beds white and tidy in front of our little house in Durham. But they never lived inside those walls where her voice turned sharp and cold whenever she looked at me as if my existence were an inconvenience she had been forced to tolerate. I used to think it started when my dad died when I was 12 and Ethan was 17, because the night he fell down the stairs, we heard a thud so loud it made the house shake, and my mother screamed his name before running to him while Ethan stood at the top of the staircase breathing hard, with a look I did not understand, and when the police asked what happened, my mother answered before anyone else could. She said he tripped. She said it with a steady voice. She said it so fast, the officers barely wrote the words down, and for years I repeated the story because I was a child who believed that mothers did not lie about the death of the man they claimed to love. After Dad's funeral, everything changed. Ethan became the center of her world, the golden boy who deserved everything, and I became the spare piece she resented for reasons she never said aloud. She told me I was dramatic when I cried at night. She told me I was ungrateful when I got sick. She told me I was stupid when I asked for help with homework, and when I sprained my ankle at 14, she called it attention-seeking because Ethan had just won a scholarship for a sports program, and she accused me of trying to ruin his moment. By the time I was 16, I figured out that if Ethan wanted something, he got it whether it belonged to him or not, because our mother believed the sun rose and set on her son, and anyone who made his life harder, including me, was the enemy. He stole my phone once and smashed it when I refused to let him read my messages, but she made me apologize for stressing him out. He shoved me into a metal mailbox on the way home from school, leaving a bruise the size of his fist on my ribs, but she said boys roughhoused and I was too sensitive. I tried to leave home after high school. I even got accepted into a nursing program in Raleigh, but the week before orientation, my mother called the school pretending to be me and withdrew my enrollment, telling me later that she had saved me from making a foolish decision because I was not ready for the real world and needed to stay close to family. Ethan laughed through the entire argument while I sobbed into my pillow that night, realizing the life I wanted was now locked behind a door my mother had no intention of ever letting me open. When I finally got into a community college nursing program without telling her, I hid my acceptance letter in a shoebox behind my dresser, but she found it the same day the financial aid office emailed me. She stormed into my room, holding the letter like a piece of evidence from a crime scene, and said, "How dare you plan to leave this house when your brother needs you?" And when I told her I needed a life too, she slapped me so hard, my ears rang, and Ethan laughed from the hallway, calling me a brat who wanted to abandon the family. I worked part-time at a clinic and saved every dollar I could because I kept telling myself one day I would get out. One day I would be strong enough, but every time I made progress, she found a way to drag me back. When I injured my knee during a training shift and needed surgery, she said I did it on purpose to get sympathy. She refused to pick me up from the hospital, so a coworker drove me home, and when I came through the door on crutches, Ethan looked at me with disgust and said, "You are unbelievable. Now we all have to deal with you." The weeks that followed were a blur of pain medication ice packs and my mother listing all the ways I had ruined her life by being weak because in her mind my injury was not a misfortune. It was an inconvenience placed on her shoulders. She locked up the pain medicine once, claiming she didn't trust me, then kicked my crutches out from under me because I walked too slowly. And when I fell, she said, "If you put this much effort into being useful, you wouldn't be such a burden." I tried to tell a school counselor once about the things happening at home, but my mother found out and dragged me out of the building by my backpack, telling the staff I was unstable and making up stories for attention. After that, no one asked questions again because she had learned how to paint me as the unreliable one. And the more she repeated it, the more the world believed her. So when Ethan beat me with my own crutch that night, when my legs buckled and my vision blurred, and I begged my mother for help, the truth is she did not see a daughter in pain. She saw a problem that needed to be put back in line. And when she told him to hit harder, it was not the first time she had chosen him over me. It was simply the first time the violence became loud enough that even I could no longer make excuses for a family that had been breaking me in slow, silent ways, long before a piece of metal ever struck my skin. I wish I could say the night Ethan beat me with my crutch was a sudden explosion, something unpredictable, something no one could have seen coming. But the truth is, it was simply the night their intentions finally grew loud enough that even I could no longer pretend they were just angry, stressed or tired, because everything that happened began 3 days earlier when my mother stood in the doorway of my room holding a stack of papers and said, "Lydia, come downstairs. Your brother needs you." I was propped against my pillows, icing my swollen knee after physical therapy, exhausted and sore. But when my mother used that voice, the one that left no room for refusal, I dragged myself upright and followed her, hobbling one step at a time down the narrow hallway and into the kitchen, where Ethan sat at the table flipping a pen between his fingers, pretending to look casual, but his knee bounced nonstop and his eyes were too bright with something desperate. My mother placed the papers in front of me like a waitress setting down a menu and said, "Sign, these your brother needs a little help with a loan, and since you are living here, rent-free." It is the least you can do, and when I picked them up and scanned the first paragraph, my stomach twisted because this was not a small loan, not even close. It was a co-signer agreement for $40,000 tied to my name, my credit, my future. I said no before she finished her sentence. Ethan stared at me like I had personally betrayed him and said, "Come on, Lyd, it's nothing, it's just to help me bridge a few things, and Mom said, don't make this difficult. You owe us after everything we have done for you." And when I told her that signing would ruin my credit, she snapped her fingers and said, "You're being dramatic again. You always exaggerate." But I wasn't exaggerating. I had learned enough in my nursing program to understand what debt could do to a person, how one signature could chain you to someone else's. Mistakes for years, and I told them both I wouldn't do it, which was when something in my mother's expression shifted. Not sadness, not disappointment, something colder. A flicker of anger tightly controlled like a flame cupped inside her hand. She stepped closer until I could smell the perfume she used every day. The one she said made her feel powerful, and she whispered, "You are part of this family. You will do what is best for this family." It was not a request. I backed away using the counter for balance and said, "I am not signing those papers." And Ethan slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "You selfish, worthless little burden." And my mother said, "Ethan, calm down." But her voice carried no real warning, only irritation that her plan was not going smoothly. When I turned to leave, Ethan grabbed my arm, squeezing so hard my vision blurred, and he shoved me against the wall, shouting, sign the papers, while my mother stood with her arms crossed, watching like a teacher overseeing two misbehaving children. I wrenched free, limping down the hallway as fast as my injured leg would allow, slammed my bedroom door shut, turned the lock, and pressed my back to the wood as my whole body shook because deep down I knew this wasn't over, not even close. That night, I heard them pacing outside my door, whispering, arguing the floor, creaking beneath their steps, as if the house itself was warning me to run. But running was not something I could do. Not with my knee, not with my lack of money, not with my life still tangled in theirs. The next morning, the door to my room was cracked open slightly, even though I knew I had locked it, and when I checked my drawers, I found my savings envelope missing the one I kept hidden under old sweaters. The one that held the only $800 I had scraped together since surgery, and my mother simply said, "Consider it payment for everything we do for you." Later that evening, Ethan barged into my room without knocking, grabbed my phone off my nightstand and scrolled through it, muttering pathetic useless, always whining before throwing it across the room where it hit the wall and shattered into pieces. When I screamed at him to stop, he stepped so close I could feel his breath on my cheek and said, "If you ever talk back again, I swear I will make you regret it." And when I looked at my mother standing behind him, she did nothing. Not a flinch, not a word, not a hint of concern. I spent the next 2 days barely speaking, barely eating, barely sleeping because some instinct deep inside me knew the pressure was building towards something violent, something inevitable, something that would leave a mark far deeper than the bruises already blooming along my arms. When the moment finally came, the shouting, the papers, the threats, the shoving, the rage, the fear, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth as I crawled across the floor. It felt like the natural endpoint of a story they had been writing long before I ever realized I was the one cast as the villain in my own home. And when Ethan raised the crutch above his head and my mother told him to hit harder, all I could think was that this was the night they stopped pretending. This was the night they no longer bothered hiding. What they had always believed that my body, my voice, my future belonged to them, and the only sin I had committed was trying to keep even a small piece of it for myself. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, I thought for a brief, disoriented second that maybe I had died because everything around me was white and humming and too bright. But then a sharp ache rolled across my ribs, and the memory of the crutch slamming into my back came rushing back like a wave of ice water, and I realized I was still alive, still trapped, still tethered to a family that treated my survival like an inconvenience. A nurse with soft brown eyes hovered above me calling for a doctor and adjusting the oxygen tubing near my cheek, and she asked me if I could hear her, if I could tell her my name. But before I could speak, my mother appeared at my bedside, gripping her purse strap and stepping between me and the nurse like she owned the right to block any truth I might try to release. She let out a shaky breath and said to the nurse, She fell again. She is always tripping over things, and it took everything in me not to choke on the bitterness that rose in my throat, because the lie came so easily to her, like she had practiced it on the drive over. Ethan stood near the doorway, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine as if he were the victim of an embarrassing situation instead of the reason my body felt like shattered glass. The nurse glanced at me again. Her brow furrowed as she studied my bruises, the pattern, the angles, the obvious impact marks that did not match a fall. But she didn't challenge my mother, not yet, because too many nurses had been trained to stay neutral, to not escalate, to avoid assuming the worst, even when the worst was written across a patient's skin, like a confession. When my mother finally stepped aside long enough for me to find my voice, I whispered, "They hurt me." But she squeezed my hand so hard it sent a bolt of pain up my arm, and she leaned down close, her lips brushing my ear as she hissed, "If you say one more word, you will regret it." I froze. I always froze. That was the part of the abuse people never understood. They thought survival meant fighting back, clawing, screaming, running. But sometimes survival meant staying silent just long enough to make it out alive. The doctor came in, examined my ribs, asked questions in a tired voice, and my mother answered every one of them with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the lines for years. She said I was clumsy. She said I never listened. She said the crutches were new and I hadn't adjusted. Ethan nodded along like a good son playing backup in a performance. When the doctor mentioned the bruising didn't make sense for a fall, my mother let out a laugh too loud, too bright, and said, "You know how she is always doing too much, then complaining later." The doctor didn't push further. He simply charted the injuries, ordered more tests, and walked out, leaving me with the sinking realization that the people who were supposed to protect me either wouldn't or couldn't, because my mother's performance was polished and practiced, and impossible for strangers to see through in a matter of minutes. Later that night, after they left to get coffee, the nurse returned the same one with soft eyes, but this time her expression carried something sharper, like recognition. She sat on the edge of the bed and said quietly, "Your injuries don't match what your mother said," and I stared at her afraid to speak because if I opened my mouth, the dam might break and everything I had kept buried would spill into the room and drown me. She didn't push right away. She simply adjusted my blanket and said, "Sometimes people get hurt at home, and they are scared to talk about it," and when I still didn't respond, she added, "You don't have to tell me anything now, but start documenting everything. Take photos, save messages, keep copies of medical records. Little things create big truths." It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me like I had worth, like I wasn't invisible, like maybe surviving didn't have to mean staying silent forever. But when my mother returned to the room, the nurse stepped back instantly, her expression flattening into neutrality, because she knew better than to provoke a woman like Marlene Rowan. My mother spent the next hour lecturing me about how I was embarrassing her, how the hospital staff was now suspicious, how everything was my fault for being weak. She sat with her legs crossed, reapplying lipstick while telling me that if I dared to tell anyone what happened, she would claim I was lying for attention, and that no one would believe a girl who couldn't even walk across a room without falling over. Ethan sent a few texts during the night. Loud buzzing sounds that made me flinch, each vibration feeling like another blow across my ribs. One message flashed briefly on the screen when my mother's phone lit up Ethan saying, "Make sure she keeps her mouth shut." She angled the phone away, but I had already seen it. By the time morning crept in through the blinds, I knew nothing would change if I kept living in that house, because the violence had escalated to a level I might not survive next time. And for the first time in years, a small, fragile thought whispered through my mind. Maybe I needed to run. Not someday, not eventually, but soon, because staying meant dying slowly in a cage built by the two people who were supposed to love me. When I was discharged, my mother signed the paperwork with a smile, bragging to the staff about her resilience as a single mother dealing with a dramatic daughter, and as I watched her spin her lies with ease, I realized something else, something chilling. She genuinely believed she had the right to rewrite my reality, and as long as she believed that she would never stop hurting me until I stopped being useful to her. And that was the moment I understood that escaping them wouldn't just save my life. It would expose theirs. The night I got home from the hospital, something inside me felt different. Not stronger exactly, but sharper, like a thin line of steel had finally formed beneath all the years of bruises and apologies and silences. because while my mother lectured me about being dramatic and wasting hospital resources and embarrassing the Rowan family name, I realized she was no longer talking to the same girl she had spent years molding into a quiet, obedient shadow. I sat on the edge of my bed, my new crutches leaning against the nightstand, and listened to her rant about responsibility and respect and loyalty. But her words slid off me like water off glass because for the first time in my life, I was looking at her and seeing not a mother but a warning, a flashing sign telling me that if I didn't pull myself out soon, I would drown in the version of me she wanted to keep powerless forever. When she finally left my room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames, I let myself breathe for the first time all day, and I whispered to no one, "I need help." I didn't know who to turn to except the one person at the hospital who had looked at me like I was a human being instead of a liability. I found the small card Nurse Danielle had tucked into my discharge folder, her handwriting soft but firm, saying, "Call if you ever feel unsafe." And I stared at the number for a long moment, my thumb trembling above the screen before I finally dialed. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, steady in a way that made my chest tighten, as if I had been holding my breath for years. When I told her I was home and that things didn't feel right, she didn't question, she didn't hesitate. She simply said, "Lydia, you deserve to feel safe, and the first step to that is building evidence." She explained how domestic abuse cases rarely moved forward without documentation, how I needed to start recording dates, times, injuries, words, anything that proved a pattern. She told me to take photos of every bruise and to back them up to an email only I could access. She told me to write down everything I remembered from that night and from the days before while the memories were still fresh. She told me to request copies of my medical records, even if my mother insisted on handling the paperwork, because legally they were mine. Then she said something that shifted the entire ground beneath me. "You are not imagining this. Lydia, the way they treat you is not normal. It is abuse, and the sooner you accept that truth, the sooner you can protect yourself." I cried silently, listening to her, because no one had ever said the word abuse out loud in my life. And hearing it spoken by someone who believed me made the reality settle in my bones. When I hung up, I wiped my face, took out my phone, and began photographing the constellation of bruises across my ribs, my back, my arms, the discoloration already turning sick, shades of purple and yellow. My hands shook, but I kept going, snapping every angle, every mark, because Danielle was right. Little truths create big truths. The next day, after my mother left for work, I limped to the library 3 blocks away and used the public computer to send myself copies of everything, including a long, detailed email describing every blow, every threat, every lie. I created a new email account with a password my family could never guess and stored everything there. And because Danielle had mentioned legal help, I searched for victim advocacy in Durham and found the website for an attorney named Miles Keaton who specialized in domestic violence and financial abuse cases. His reviews described him as relentless, unshakable, the kind of lawyer who fought for people who had been ignored too long. I filled out the online form describing my situation in the vaguest terms possible, just enough to get his attention, and I was shocked when he responded within the hour, asking to meet privately. I knew I needed an excuse to leave the house without raising suspicion, so I told my mother I needed more ice packs for my knee, and she waved me off, barely looking up from her magazine. At the law office, Miles greeted me with a calm, steady presence that made me feel for the first time in months like I was sitting with someone who operated on truth, not manipulation. I told him about the crutch, the bruises, the loan papers, the years of being controlled, and each time I paused, expecting disbelief, expecting judgment, he simply nodded and said, "Keep going." When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "Lydia, what your family is doing is not only abusive, it is criminal." He outlined steps we needed to take immediately. Freeze your credit place, a fraud alert request, full reports from all 3 bureaus document every injury. Contact the police quietly and file an affidavit before your brother can use your identity again. My head spun because no one had ever given me a path forward before. No one had ever spoken about protecting me, only controlling me. and hearing someone talk about options made me feel like the world had cracks where light could finally slip through. Miles also recommended hiring a private investigator, explaining that people like my mother and brother often hid financial secrets, lies, debts, things that could become leverage in court. The idea terrified me, but I agreed because I had spent too long living in fear, and I was done letting fear write my future. When I left his office, I felt the first flicker of something I barely recognized: hope. Not loud, not triumphant, just a small pulse inside my chest reminding me I was still alive, and that maybe surviving didn't just mean staying quiet. Maybe it meant preparing for the day I would no longer have to be quiet at all. The private investigator Miles recommended turned out to be a quiet, middle-aged man named Warren Hale, who dressed like he belonged in a library rather than tracking down the worst secrets people tried to bury. And when he shook my hand in the law office, he said in a low, steady voice, "I do not take cases unless I believe the client is in real danger, and your situation qualifies without question." I gave him every detail I could remember, every incident, every bruise, every threat, and he listened without flinching, taking notes in a battered leather notebook while occasionally asking small clarifying questions about dates and bank accounts and the kind of things I had never thought mattered. He said he would need a week to gather information, and during that week, I lived like a ghost moving silently through the Rowan household, observing things I should have noticed years ago, like how my mother locked her bedroom door every night, or how Ethan hid his phone screen every time he passed me in the hallway, or how whispering always stopped when I limped into a room as if my presence alone disrupted some plan they were still building against me. For 7 days, I documented everything: bruises, pain levels, comments they made, every denial, every attempt to twist what happened into my fault, and every night I checked my hidden email account from the library, uploading the newest photos and notes, because if something happened to me again, I needed proof that their cruelty was not imagination, but intent. On the 8th morning, Warren emailed saying we need to meet immediately, and his tone was so grave I felt my stomach drop. I called an Uber since my mother had taken my car keys weeks ago, claiming I was unsafe to drive, even though it was just another way to keep me trapped. And when I arrived at Miles' office, Warren was already seated, flipping through a thick folder stuffed with documents. He waited until I sat, then pushed the folder toward me and said, "Lydia, this is only the beginning, but you need to see it." My hands shook as I opened it, and the first page almost knocked the air from my lungs because it was a summary of my brother Ethan's financial status, something I had never known until that moment. He was $68,000 in debt from online sports betting cryptocurrency trades and something called margin loss, a term I barely understood, but the investigator had written next to it with one margin account alone. He lost nearly $20,000 in a single month. The next page showed 3 credit cards opened in the last year, all maxed out, all tied to addresses linked to Ethan, but the shock came when Warren flipped to the following page and showed me an application for a personal loan under my name, with Ethan listed as the contact point, and my mother's handwriting filling out the justification section saying the money would be for household medical expenses. I stared at the signature line where my name had been forged, and the room tilted slightly as if gravity had shifted, because suddenly, the night they tried to force me to sign the loan papers made sickening sense. They had already used my identity behind my back and were trying to make it look legitimate before the bank discovered the inconsistency. I whispered, "They were going to ruin me," and Warren nodded once, saying they still might if we do not act fast. Then he flipped to another section marked audio transcripts. My throat tightened as he pressed play on a small recorder, and I heard my mother's voice, cold, sharp, unmistakable, saying to Ethan if she doesn't cooperate, "Use her information, she owes us and she will not fight." Ethan replied in a low, smug tone, saying she never fights, she cries, and then she gives up. My stomach twisted violently. Warren paused the audio and said that recording was obtained legally. "Your mother speaks loudly on the back porch at night. She seems to assume no one is listening." He pressed play again, this time capturing Ethan saying, "If the bank calls, what do we do?" and my mother replying, "You say she agreed. You say she signed. You say she is confused from pain pills. She is easy to discredit." Hearing the woman who raised me speak about me like a disposable tool made something inside my chest cave inward, and then harden into something cold enough to burn. Warren turned the next few pages, revealing screenshots of text messages between my mother and Ethan discussing my bank balance, which they apparently accessed through old paperwork they had kept from when I was a minor. Messages saying things like, "Check her drawer, she hides cash, and take the envelope tonight before she spends it." I felt nauseous because I had thought the missing savings envelope was just one more petty cruelty, not part of a larger system of exploitation. Next came phone records linking my mother to 3 different high-interest lenders, all contacted within the same month, all inquiries tied back to my full legal name. Warren circled each one and said this shows clear intent to commit financial abuse and identity fraud. Miles leaned forward, his voice low, steady, saying,
"Lydia, this is more than abuse. This is criminal conspiracy, and if you choose to pursue charges, we have enough to begin a strong case."
But Warren wasn't done. He flipped to the final section, the one labeled Family Incidents, and said, "There is something else, something you need to see, but I need you to prepare yourself." My heart thudded loudly as he slid forward a photocopy of the police report from the night my father died. The official statement, it said accidental fall, but Warren had dug further, requesting phone records from that night, showing a call from a neighbor at 8:49 p.m.
Me.
Reporting shouting inside the Rowan home minutes before the fall. The neighbor's statement at the time was dismissed because my mother insisted it was just a family disagreement, but Warren had obtained a suppressed note from the first responding officer mentioning fresh scrapes on Ethan's knuckles when they arrived. I stared at the report, my hands trembling, remembering the way Ethan had stood at the top of the stairs that night, breathing hard, eyes unreadable, and how my mother had answered every question before anyone else could speak. Warren said, "I cannot prove what happened that night, not yet, but based on patterns, based on interviews, based on your family's documented behavior. It is my professional opinion that your father's fall may not have been an accident." The floor seemed to vanish beneath me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself because for years I had carried guilt for not running to help, for not understanding, for not speaking up. And now the possibility that they had lied about his death, that they had hidden something this big, felt like a new wound carving through the old ones. Miles placed a steadying hand on the table between us and said, "Lydia, this is why people like your mother depend on silence. They know the truth would destroy everything they built, and now you know exactly what you are up against." I looked at the pile of evidence, at the forged documents, at the audio recordings, at the loan applications, at the hints that my father's death might have been covered up, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel fear swallowing me. I felt something stronger, rising, a decision, crystallizing a promise that I would no longer be the quiet girl who let them rewrite reality. I said one sentence, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I want to take all of it down." When I left Miles' office carrying the thick folder of evidence against my own family, the air outside felt different, sharper, heavier, like the world itself had shifted half an inch to the left. And even though my knees trembled with every step, something fierce had begun forming inside me. Something that felt like a spine made of iron, because for the first time in my life I had truth, and truth was louder than fear. I clutched the folder in both hands during the Uber ride home, staring at my own name forged across loan documents, listening to the echo of my mother's voice on that recording, telling Ethan to use my identity if I did not cooperate. And by the time I reached my street, the trembling had stopped, replaced by a cold, quiet determination. When I walked inside the Rowan house, my mother was sitting at the table filing her nails like nothing in the world concerned her, and Ethan was sprawled across the couch watching a game, his shoes on the pillows, and when they looked up at me, I forced myself to breathe slow, steady, because Warren's warning rang in my head, "Do not confront them yet. Not until everything is in place." My mother asked in her saccharine voice, "Where have you been?" And I answered with the same flat tone I had used all my life, "The library," and she said, "Good, keep yourself busy like a good girl," and turned away, not knowing that the girl she was talking to was already gone, already replaced by someone who had finally seen the full blueprint of their cruelty. That night, I locked my bedroom door and spent hours sorting through the evidence, highlighting dates, labeling files, backing everything up to the secret email account, and then creating a second backup on a flash drive. I hid inside the lining of my backpack because if my mother ever found even one piece of this, their reaction would be dangerous. I printed duplicates of every forged document, photographed each audio transcript, and created a timeline of every event in the past year, every bruise, every theft, every threat, because Miles said the strongest cases came from clarity, and the Rowan family had spent years teaching me chaos, but they had not prepared for me learning order. Over the next few days, I played the role they expected, the limping, quiet girl who kept her eyes down and her voice soft while inside. I mapped their routines, my mother leaving the house at exactly 7:18 a.m. for her job at the dental office, Ethan disappearing for hours in the middle of the night to meet people Miles suspected were connected to his gambling debts and their habit of leaving their room unlocked only when distracted. I knew exactly when I could move without being seen, exactly when their attention drifted. On Wednesday morning, when my mother was already gone and Ethan was snoring loudly, I slipped into her bedroom, heart pounding so hard it felt like the walls had begun vibrating around me. I searched through her drawers carefully, lifting each item with the edge of a tissue to avoid leaving fingerprints, and found exactly what Warren predicted. 3 envelopes containing cash receipts, loan applications, and a list of lenders scrawled in her handwriting under a header that read, "Emergency funds using Lid's identity." My jaw tightened as I photographed every page, then placed them back precisely where I found them, because if she suspected anything, the backlash would be immediate and violent. At the clinic where I worked part-time, they had offered me extra shifts, and I accepted all of them because having my own income was no longer just helpful, it was necessary. I used part of my paycheck to open a new checking account at a different bank under strict privacy settings, something my mother and brother could not access because Miles said financial separation was the first step to legal separation. The teller asked if I wanted a debit card mailed to my home, and I almost laughed, imagining my mother's face if she found mail addressed to me for an account she did not know existed, so I said no, I will pick it up in person. Danielle, the nurse, called to check on me twice that week, and when I told her I had met with an attorney and a private investigator, she said, "Lydia, that is brave. That is exactly what you need to do." And even though the word brave still felt foreign in my mouth, I let it sit there because maybe bravery was not loud. Maybe it was quiet, preparation in the dark. Each night, I lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of my mother pacing, or Ethan slamming cabinet doors, and instead of shrinking the way I always had, I studied the rhythm of the house, memorizing it until I could hear the difference between anger and distraction, between plotting and panic. By Friday, Miles emailed to say the full fraud report was ready and the affidavit was prepared for the police to sign once I gave the green light. I stared at his message for a long minute, my pulse thundering because this was the moment everything began turning from preparation into action. And even though fear tried to curl its fingers around my throat, I pushed it off. That afternoon, I pretended to rest in my room, but behind the locked door, I packed a small duffel bag with essentials: clothes, medications, the flash drive, a copy of the evidence folder, and the card Danielle had given me because the plan was set. Now I just had to follow it. On Saturday morning, when my mother demanded I accompany her to the store, I told her no, and the shock on her face was so sharp, so instant, that for a moment I tasted victory. Ethan muttered something under his breath about finally growing a spine, but neither of them knew I had already grown something far stronger, a truth that was no longer willing to stay silent. What they also did not know was that in less than 48 hours, I would no longer be living under their roof, no longer under their control, and that every secret they had buried would surface in a way none of them could stop, because the turning point had already happened quietly, silently, invisibly, and now the storm that followed was no longer theirs. It was mine. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of heavy stillness that settles over a house right before a storm cracks it open, and even though I spent the whole day moving quietly, preparing silently, waiting for the moment I could finally leave, something in the air felt wrong, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Around 7, my mother called up the stairs in that familiar sugary tone. "Lydia, come down here, we need to talk," and every instinct in my body tightened because she only used that tone when she was hiding something behind her back. I hesitated long enough to slip the flash drive deeper into my duffel bag. Then I crutched my way downstairs, slow, deliberate, trying to look smaller, weaker, distracted the way they expected me to. Ethan was standing beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight, foot tapping, and the moment I reached the bottom step, he said, "We need to settle something tonight." My mother motioned to the kitchen table where a stack of papers sat neatly arranged, and she said, "Sit down, Lydia." But I stayed standing, gripping my crutch, because something in the air felt like danger. She sighed dramatically and said, "You are making this harder than it needs to be." Your brother needs help one last time, and you are going to sign the agreement so we can all move forward." When I didn't answer, Ethan shoved the chair backward with his foot and said, "Sit down now," but I didn't move, and the flicker of surprise in his eyes gave me a tiny sliver of strength. My mother picked up the papers, flipped them toward me, and said, "The bank needs your signature by tomorrow. There is no choice." And the way she said "no choice" made something inside my chest twist, because for 24 years she had turned that phrase into a weapon, a leash, a promise that my voice didn't matter. I scanned the papers without touching them and felt heat rush to my face because this wasn't a simple loan document. This was a consolidation agreement tying multiple debts into one massive account under my name alone, with a forged signature already printed on 2 of the pages. Ethan watched me read, his chest puffed with impatience, and he said, "Just sign it, you always drag everything out. And Mom added you owe us Lydia after everything we have done for you." For a moment, I felt the old fear rising, the instinct to fold, the instinct to shrink, the instinct to obey just to survive. But then I remembered Warren's folder, the forged applications, the audio recordings, my father's unfinished story. The nurse who believed me, the attorney who said my case was strong. The quiet strength that had carried me this far. I said no. The word came out steady, quiet, but sharp enough to slice the room in half. My mother blinked like she hadn't heard me correctly, and she said, "Excuse me," and I repeated slower, "No." Ethan stepped forward until he was inches from my face and snarled, "You don't get to say no in this house." And before I could brace myself, he grabbed my injured arm, squeezing hard enough to make my vision flash white. I stumbled but didn't fall, and that only seemed to make him angrier because he shoved me again, harder this time, slamming me against the wall, the crutch jamming between my ribs. My mother didn't rush to stop him, didn't gasp, didn't panic. She only said in a bored, flat tone, "Ethan, stop messing around. She just needs a push." A push. Like I was a faulty object needing adjustment, not a human being who had survived their hands for years. Ethan grabbed the back of my shirt, yanking me toward the table, and said, "Sign the papers, or we will make you do it." And though the fear clawed at my spine, something else rose too, the realization that they truly believed I had no power, no choices, no help, no evidence, no plan. They still thought I was the quiet girl they had spent years breaking. They had no idea what was coming. I twisted out of his grip enough to say, "Leave me alone." And the moment the words left my mouth, he snapped. He lunged forward, knocking my crutch from under me, sending it clattering across the tile. And when I hit the ground, the pain shot through my knee so sharply I tasted metal. He stood over me, towering like a shadow, blocking out everything, and my mother didn't move to stop him. She only adjusted her sweater like the scene unfolding was something inconvenient she'd been forced to watch. Ethan leaned down, grabbed my wrist, and snarled, "You think you're better than us. You think you can talk to lawyers behind our backs," and my heart stuttered because that meant they knew. Somehow they knew. My mother stepped closer, her voice cold as ice, and said, "You really thought we wouldn't find the number on the caller ID. You really thought we wouldn't check your room. You really thought we wouldn't figure out what you were planning." I froze. They had searched my things. They had gone through my drawers. Maybe they found my notes. Maybe they saw the missing papers. Maybe they saw the emails. For a moment, panic surged inside me like wildfire, but then logic cut through it sharp and clear. My flash drive was hidden, my notes were coded, my email was on a library computer. They had not found everything, not the most important pieces. Ethan yanked me upright by my shirt, my injured leg buckling beneath me as he dragged me toward the table, saying, "Sit down and sign the papers, or so help me." And before he could finish the sentence, I said louder than I meant to, "Don't touch me." It startled both of them enough that Ethan loosened his grip for half a second, and I used that moment to wrench my arm free and grab my fallen crutch. My mother's face twisted with disgust, and she spat, "You ungrateful little parasite, look at everything we have done for you. And this is how you repay us." And with each word, something inside me finally snapped, because her lies no longer held any power over me. I straightened slowly, using the crutch for balance, and said, my voice low but steady, "I know what you both did, and I am done letting you do it again." Ethan laughed a harsh, ugly sound, saying, "You think anyone is going to believe you?" And my mother added, "The police laugh at girls like you. You have no proof, you never have." And that was when I realized the truth that made my heartbeat steady. They didn't know. They didn't know about Warren. They didn't know about Miles. They didn't know about the files, the recordings, the emails, the evidence. They only knew enough to feel threatened, not enough to understand how much trouble they were standing in. I looked at them both and said softly, but with a strength I didn't know I could ever possess, "I have more proof than you think, and in less than 24 hours, you are going to learn exactly how much." My mother's face paled for the first time in my life. Ethan's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his features like a spark caught in a wire. And in that moment, despite the throbbing pain in my ribs and the tremor in my legs, I felt something powerful, unshakable, unstoppable, rising through me. The beginning of the end. The moment I said "I have more proof than you think," something shifted in the air like a glass pane cracking under too much pressure, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across my mother's face. Not much, just a tiny tremor in the muscles around her mouth, but it was enough to tell me the balance of power had tilted, even if only by an inch. Ethan stepped forward again, jaw clenched, shoulders puffed like he was preparing to tackle me. And I knew that if I didn't move quickly, he would shove me against the wall again, or knock the crutch from under me, or drag me to the table until I signed whatever forged mess they had prepared. So I forced my voice steady and said, "I need my medication upstairs. My knee is locking." My mother rolled her eyes and said, "Hurry up, but do not try anything," and I nodded, looking defeated because that was the version of me. They knew, the one who always broke under pressure, but inside, my pulse was pounding with one clear plan. I grabbed my crutch and limped slowly up the stairs, each step sending sharp pain through my knee, but every inch mattered because I knew exactly what I needed from my room. The duffel bag I had packed the flash drive with every piece of evidence, the printed timeline, the hidden cash Danielle had dropped off for me at the clinic, with a note that said "just in case." When I reached my room, I closed the door halfway, pretending to search for the medicine bottle while sliding the duffel bag strap over my shoulder. My hands shook not from fear, but from adrenaline, a force that made my limbs move faster than my thoughts. I texted one word to Miles from the library burner email emergency and then slipped my phone into my pocket. Outside my door, I heard Ethan pacing at the bottom of the stairs, his heavy boots thudding like distant thunder, warning me that time was running out. I knew I couldn't walk out the front door because he would block me. I knew I couldn't jump from the window because my knee would never survive the landing, and I knew I couldn't stall much longer because they would come looking. Then I remembered the side door, the one connected to the laundry room, the one with the faulty latch that my mother always yelled about but never fixed because she assumed no one in the house would dare to use it. I eased my door open just enough to see the hallway empty. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved softly down the carpeted floor, the duffel bag hidden behind my leg like luggage made of stolen truth. When I reached the laundry room, I could hear Ethan laughing downstairs, telling my mother she won't try anything she never does. I didn't breathe again until I eased the side door open, praying the hinge wouldn't squeak. And when it didn't, I nearly collapsed from relief. I stepped outside into the humid North Carolina night, the scent of cut grass mixing with the sharp smell of fear and freedom, and I walked as fast as my broken body allowed down the side yard, through the gate, and into the dark street behind the house. Once I was a block away, I called the number Miles had given me for emergencies. He answered on the first ring, his voice, calm, serious, saying, "Lydia, tell me where you are and stay where I can find you." I told him the street corner, and less than 7 minutes later his car pulled up. Headlights dimmed, window rolling down as he said, "Get in!" I climbed into the passenger seat, dropping the duffel bag onto my lap, shaking with adrenaline as he pulled away from my mother's house, the place that had held my childhood, my nightmares, my bruises, my silence. I looked back at it shrinking behind us, and instead of guilt, all I felt was a strange, quiet coldness, like grief for a home that had never existed. Miles drove us to his office building, which was dark at this hour except for his corner light, and once inside, he locked the door and motioned for me to sit. He asked me what happened, and I told him everything: the confrontation, the forged documents, the threats, the fact that they had found out enough to be terrified, but not enough to understand the full scope of what was coming for them. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and said, "Lydia, you did the right thing getting out because based on their escalation tonight, your physical safety was at serious risk." Then he opened his laptop, pulled up the affidavit, and said, "We are filing tonight." I watched as he assembled the packet, the police report request, the fraud alerts, the petition for a protective order, the the request for criminal investigation into identity theft and financial abuse, and every document felt like a brick placed into a wall between me and the people who had spent years tearing me down. He also called Warren, who answered in his calm, steady voice, saying, "I have more for you both," and arrived within 20 minutes carrying a second folder thicker than the first. In it were new discoveries, bank withdrawals under my name from a year earlier, my mother's signature appearing on forms she should never have touched, and most damning of all, a voicemail she had left on her sister's phone complaining that Lydia is too fragile to fight back. "We can use whatever we need." Miles said this was gold, pure gold, because it demonstrated intent manipulation and exploitation. Then came the moment everything shifted from preparation to the ignition of war. Miles placed a typed document in front of me and said, "This is your official statement to the authorities." I read the first line. "We request immediate investigation into physical assault, financial exploitation, and identity fraud committed by Marlene Rowan and Ethan Rowan," and my entire body went still. He said if you sign this, everything begins. The legal dominoes start falling. They lose control. They lose the narrative. And I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and signed my name in one clean stroke. Miles scanned it, emailed it directly to 2 detectives he'd already briefed earlier in the week, and within minutes, my phone buzzed with a confirmation message from the police department stating they had received the emergency petition and were dispatching a wellness check to the Rowan residence. My stomach tightened, imagining the moment they knocked on my mother's door, the confusion on her face, the anger in Ethan's eyes, the realization that their silent, powerless girl had not only escaped, but had chosen to expose them utterly. Miles handed me a temporary phone the police could reach me through and said, "You are not going back to that house. Not tonight, not ever again." We arranged for me to stay at a secure women's shelter for the night when he trusted one with private rooms and reinforced security, and as he drove me there, I felt every breath in my chest loosen, as if, for the first time in years, I had air that belonged to me. When I stepped inside the quiet, dim shelter lobby, the receptionist smiled warmly and said, "Welcome. You are safe now." And I almost cried because safe had never been a word that applied to my life before. I lay down in the small clean room, clutching the duffel bag that held every piece of truth I had gathered, and even though fear still curled inside me, I knew something irreversible had happened tonight. I had escaped. I had signed the statement. The police were already at my old door, and by sunrise, the Rowan household would learn that the girl they thought they owned had slipped through their fingers and lit a match that would burn every lie they built. Morning sunlight cut across the small shelter room in thin, pale stripes, and for a moment when I opened my eyes, I didn't recognize where I was because the air felt still and warm and safe. A feeling so foreign it made my throat tighten. Then everything came rushing back the escape. The police report, Miles scanning the affidavit, the officers dispatched to the house I once called home, and I sat up slowly, gripping the edge of the bed because today was the day everything cracked open. My temporary phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I answered, a detective's calm voice said, "Lydia, this is Detective Ramos. We conducted the welfare check last night. We need to speak with you in person this morning. It's important." A cold shiver ran through me. But I said yes immediately because there was no going back. Miles drove me to the police station himself, insisting I shouldn't walk in alone. When we entered the small interview room, Detective Ramos and Detective Hill were waiting with a folder on the table, their expressions serious but not unkind. Ramos began with the question I feared most. "Lydia, is there any chance you want to retract what you shared in your affidavit?" I said no so firmly the answer surprised even me. Hill nodded slowly, then said, "Then we need to inform you what we observed." They began recounting the welfare check. When officers knocked on the Rowan door around 1 p.m., "Ma," Ethan answered shirtless, agitated, insisting I was just being dramatic and had stormed out. My mother came to the door moments later, hair disheveled, wearing a robe, demanding to know who filed the report. According to the officers, she grew hostile when they asked simple questions, yelling that I always lied, that I was mentally unstable, that I was probably with some boy seeking attention. The detectives watched my face carefully as they described it. I didn't react. I had lived that script for 20 years, but then Ramos pushed a printed image toward me, a photograph taken by the officers of a stack of papers on the kitchen table, the same consolidation loan documents they had tried to force me to sign. My forged signature was clearly visible. My mother had knocked a cup of coffee over part of the stack during the argument, staining the corner, but the text and signature remained intact. Ramos said this was not an accidental find. These documents substantiate portions of your claim. I swallowed hard as he continued. Officers also photographed marks on the hallway wall consistent with impact and a broken piece of the lower banister rail. My hands trembled because I remembered Ethan shoving me there, remembered the crack of wood beneath my weight. Then Hill slid another page across the table. A voicemail transcript. Not from my phone, from my aunt's. My mother had left it earlier that week at 11:43 p.m. complaining that I was being difficult and that we will make her sign one way or another. She cannot pay us back otherwise. My mouth went dry. Ramos added there was more. In the trash, officers recovered torn pieces of another application, one for a predatory lender. This time with my social security number written in my mother's handwriting. Something inside my chest caved in and rebuilt itself in the same breath. They continued gathering statements. At 9:50 a.m., they asked me to sign a formal police statement. My hands were steadier this time. When I finished, Ramos said you should know there may be formal charges pending. Identity theft, financial fraud, domestic assault, possible conspiracy, and from his tone I understood. This wasn't just being filed, it was already moving. Miles asked what the next steps were, and the detectives explained that they were issuing a temporary protective order immediately and that officers would attempt to serve both my mother and Ethan within the next few hours. After the meeting, Miles and I stepped outside into the parking lot heat, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something close to power settling into my bones like armor. He said quietly, "Lydia, they're in serious trouble. We're not done yet. But this is a significant turn." We drove straight to his office where Warren was waiting with yet another folder. He stood when I entered and said, "There's something you need to hear." He pressed play on a short audio clip captured by his surveillance equipment. Ethan's voice filled the room, frantic and angry. "I told you we shouldn't have left the papers out. She saw something." Then my mother replying sharply, "She won't do anything. She never does. She's weak. But if she tries, we'll say she did it for attention. We'll tell them she has issues. She's always crying anyway." Then silence. Miles leaned back slowly, his eyes tightening. "This is manipulation documented in their own words. This will help a lot." But Warren wasn't done. He opened another file, revealing bank statements tied to a hidden account under my mother's name, showing multiple transfers from Ethan's debit card and several transfers labeled Reimbursement L, though I had never received anything. Warren said, "I believe this is their strategy. They drain your identity, then launder through shared accounts so tracing becomes difficult. But now that we know what to look for, the pattern is clear." Miles exhaled like he had been waiting for this. "This strengthens the case significantly." But the real breaking point came 3 hours later. I was sitting in Miles' reception area reviewing photocopies when his paralegal hurried in, saying, "Lydia, you need to come see this." We stepped into the conference room where a local news channel was airing footage from earlier that afternoon. Reporters stood outside the Rowan house capturing officers walking in and out. The headline across the screen read, "Domestic abuse allegations lead to police investigation in Durham home." The sight of my mother in the footage red-faced, screaming at officers made my stomach twist. Ethan, handcuffed on the front steps, shouting, "This is ridiculous! She's lying! She's always lying!" made something cold wash down my spine. The reporter said the investigation involves allegations of identity theft, coercion, and physical assault. The footage zoomed in on a police car door slamming shut as they took him away. My knees nearly gave out, and I gripped the conference table until the spinning slowed. I didn't feel triumph, not victory. Something else, something hollow and necessary. Miles looked at me and said, "This is not the end, but this is the collapse. You started it. You survived it. And now the law is carrying it the rest of the way." We monitored everything from that conference room. Hours later, my Miles' temporary phone buzzed again. It was Detective Hill. He said, "Lydia, your mother has retained an attorney and is denying everything, but we've gathered enough probable cause for formal charges. We will keep you updated." He paused, then added, "Ethan has already confessed to parts of the assault, claiming you provoked him, but his story does not match the evidence. The protective order is in effect. They cannot contact you under any circumstances." After hanging up, I sat there for a long while absorbing the impact of those words. Protective order, charges, confession, collapse. It didn't feel real yet. It felt like watching someone else's life burn down from a distance. The next day, we met again at the shelter with a representative from a victim advocacy group. They explained the next steps: court dates, testimonies, victim compensation programs, safe housing options, long-term counseling. My head spun with information, but one thing remained clear. I was never going back to that house. That place was dead to me now. The Rowans were no longer my keepers, and the girl they had silenced for years had walked out alive and left the door behind her in flames. 2 days later, the district attorney contacted Miles to request a meeting. They wanted to pursue full charges, not a warning, not mediation, criminal charges, identity theft, fraud, assault, coercion, possession of forged documents, possible involvement in earlier suspicious incidents, including my father's death, though that would require more investigation. My breath caught. All these years I thought I was powerless. But now, my voice carried weight in rooms my mother could never reach, among people she could never intimidate. As the day ended, I sat outside the shelter on a wooden bench, feeling the warm breeze and listening to the quiet murmur of women who had survived their own wars. The world felt bigger tonight, not kinder, but freer. When I closed my eyes, I pictured the Rowan house again, the kitchen table, the forged papers, my mother's cold stare, Ethan's fists, and then I pictured the moment the officers walked through that same front door carrying truth. For the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I simply breathed. The house had finally fallen, and I was still standing. Justice did not come in a single dramatic strike, like thunder splitting open the sky. It came in slow, steady waves, each one carrying a little more truth, a little more consequence, until the weight of everything my mother and Ethan had done finally dragged them under. The first wave hit 2 weeks after the welfare check, when Detective Ramos called to tell me the district attorney had officially filed charges against Ethan for felony assault, misdemeanor domestic violence, and attempted coercion of a vulnerable adult. Hearing the words felony assault sent a strange tremor through me. Not fear, but the surreal realization that the pain etched across my ribs and back had been translated into something real in the eyes of the law, something punishable, something undeniable. The second wave came for my mother. She was charged with financial exploitation of a dependent adult identity theft, attempted fraud, and providing forged documents to a financial institution. The DA noted in the statement that her coordination with Ethan suggested conspiracy. A word that made the air around me grow still, because for years I had been taught that I was the problem, that I was the burden, that I was the unstable one. And now the legal system was calling them by their real names. I spent those weeks going to meetings with advocates and counselors, learning how trauma rewires a person's sense of reality and how years of gaslighting could make even simple truths feel slippery. Some nights, I sat awake replaying moments from childhood, things I had dismissed as normal things. I had forgiven things I had rationalized until now. And every time a memory flashed, I had to remind myself softly and repeatedly, "You are not crazy. You were abused." The court hearings began in midsummer. I went with Miles and a support advocate by my side, and even though my knees shook every time I stepped into the courthouse, the strength that had been growing in me since the night I escaped carried me forward. Ethan refused to look at me the first trial date. But when he finally did, his eyes darted away quickly, like I was someone he no longer recognized, someone he had underestimated so badly he didn't know how to process it. My mother, on the other hand, stared straight at me with pure contempt, the kind of glare she once used to silence me in childhood, but now it felt small. Powerless, because for the first time she was sitting in a room where her word meant nothing without evidence. And mine was backed by a mountain of it. Warren testified calmly, presenting documents, recordings, photos, timelines, each piece fitting together like a map of everything they had tried to steal from me. Danielle, the nurse, attended the hearing, and when she described the bruises, the patterns, the way I whispered they hurt me, the courtroom went so quiet it felt like the entire building was holding its breath. Ethan's attorney tried to argue that I provoked the assault, but the evidence of his gambling debts, the forged applications, and his own recorded words undermined every attempt to paint him as anything other than what he was. When the judge ordered a psychological evaluation for my mother after her attorney claimed she was suffering from stress, Marlene Rowan stood up in fury, shouting, "This is all her fault. She set us up. You all believe her lies, and the bailiff had to escort her out of the courtroom." The final verdict came at the end of August. Ethan accepted a plea deal, but still received a sentence including jail time mandatory counseling probation, and a no-contact order that extended 5 years. My mother was found guilty on 3 counts, including felony identity theft and financial exploitation. She received a suspended prison sentence with strict conditions, financial restitution, mandatory therapy, and a permanent no-contact order with me. As the judge read the sentence, she looked at me with a mix of rage and disbelief, as if she truly could not understand how the world had stopped bending to her will. I walked out of that courthouse with Miles beside me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like my body belonged entirely to me. Not a possession, not a burden, not an object to be managed, but a person with a future, stretching wide and open. I moved into transitional housing provided by the advocacy program and enrolled again in the nursing program my mother had once ripped away from me. The first day I walked into class on my crutches, the professor smiled and said, "Welcome back, Lydia. We're glad you're here," and I had to blink hard because for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted in any room. I found part-time work at a clinic where the staff treated me like a colleague, not a nuisance, and I started physical therapy to regain full function in my knee. Every small milestone standing without wobbling, climbing a step without help balancing. Without the crutch felt like reclaiming pieces of myself they had tried to break. Months passed, and the nightmares came less often. The fear loosened its grip, and one crisp autumn morning, I realized I had gone an entire week without checking over my shoulder. Sometimes people from my old neighborhood asked what happened to the Rowans. I never answered. Their story wasn't mine to tell anymore, and mine was no longer bound to theirs. On quiet nights, I still thought about my father and the unanswered questions surrounding his death, but now those questions didn't paralyze me. They motivated me. Someday, maybe I would ask investigators to look again at that old report. But for now, I focused on breathing, on healing, on living. One evening after my shift, the sun dipped behind the clinic, casting warm gold across the parking lot, and I stood there feeling the weight of everything I had survived, everything I had fought for. For the first time, I felt not like a victim, but like a survivor. A woman who had walked through hell with a broken knee and a bruised body and still found her way back to herself. And as the breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves, I whispered the truth that had taken me years to learn. I am free now. Healing did not arrive with applause or fireworks, or any moment big enough to announce itself. It came quietly, in small human ways that would have been invisible to anyone but me. The first morning I woke up and didn't brace for footsteps in the hallway. The first night I slept without checking the lock 3 times. The first laugh that escaped me without guilt. The first breath that didn't hurt. Life after the Rowans was like learning to walk again. Not just physically as my knee grew stronger, but emotionally because strength had been beaten out of me for so long that I had to relearn what it sounded like inside my own chest. I spent months in therapy unraveling knots I didn't know existed. Learning how gaslighting rewired my instincts, teaching me that flinching at raised voices wasn't weakness. It was survival, learned too young. My therapist said once, "Lydia, your nervous system is bruised too. You are not healing from just physical wounds. You are healing from a lifetime of being told your reality was wrong, and hearing that made me cry harder than anything else had because it validated the pain I could never name." Nursing school became a different kind of healing. Sitting in classrooms surrounded by people who wanted to help others reminded me that the world wasn't entirely shaped like the house I grew up in, and each time I aced a test or practiced a skill or earned praise from an instructor, something inside me straightened, like a bone finally setting in its correct place. I found a small part-time job at a long-term care facility, and the older patients always wanted to talk. They told me their fears, regrets, memories, triumphs, and I listened carefully, knowing what it felt like to have a voice no one believed. One evening, a resident named Mrs. Dalton squeezed my hand and said, "You have such a steady way about you, dear, like someone who survived something and still chose kindness." And the words warmed my chest because she unknowingly named the version of myself I had been fighting to become. Outside of work, I built a life that was mine, not shaped by control or fear. I decorated my small studio apartment with thrift store treasures and photographs of quiet places that made me feel safe. I planted a pot of lilies on the windowsill because I had always wanted flowers, but my mother hated them, calling them unnecessary clutter. I made friends slowly, carefully choosing people who respected boundaries and didn't raise their voices when frustrated, people who apologized when they hurt someone. people who didn't treat vulnerability like weakness. Sometimes I still woke up from dreams where Ethan's footsteps shook the floor or my mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. But when I opened my eyes, there was no house, no dark hallway, no threat, just sunlight sliding across my blankets. One afternoon in late fall, Detective Ramos called to update me on the final case proceedings. My mother's restitution payments had officially begun her debts monitored closely by the court. Ethan had completed his first phase of mandatory counseling and would remain on probation for several years. There was no dramatic ending. No apologies, no acknowledgments, no sudden confessions, just consequences. Real ones, legal ones, ones they could not twist or blame on me. And that was enough. I didn't need them to understand what they did or why it was wrong. I didn't need them to see me as human now if they never had before. Their comprehension wasn't required for my healing. Their remorse wasn't necessary for my freedom. One Saturday in November, I drove past my old street for the first time since the night I escaped. Not to see them, not to test anything, just to prove to myself that the memory of that home no longer held power in my body. When I turned onto the block, it felt strangely small, like everything that once loomed so large had shrunk. The Rowan house sat still and silent, curtains drawn, porch empty, a yellowing notice still taped to the door reminding them of overdue property inspections they had never handled. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I simply glanced once at the place where my voice had been trapped for so long and felt nothing but distance, a clean, unbreakable distance. That night, sitting on my couch with a cup of tea and my textbooks open beside me, I realized the most important truth of all. No matter how long darkness lasts, the moment you choose yourself, the moment you step outside the door, built to confine you, the world opens. Not quickly, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to grow. Enough to begin again. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who whispered, "I need help," in a dark hospital room. The one who learned to move silently through a house filled with threats. The one who believed bruises were her fault. The one who thought no one would ever believe her story. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her, you make it out. You make it through. You make a new life that has nothing to do with pain. And maybe that is the real ending, not the court verdict, not the charges, not the collapse of the Rowan name, but the quiet victory of a girl who chose herself after years of being told she had no right to exist as she was. Sometimes people ask me, do you ever regret cutting your family off? And I always answer the same way, I didn't cut my family off. I cut the poison out, and I sleep peacefully now. When the sun sets through my window and washes my apartment in gold, I think of the world I live in now, the one I built from scraps of bravery, the one shaped not by fear, but by choice. My life is my own, finally, entirely and quietly and beautifully my own. And for the first time, I feel something I never thought I would peace,